We also have John Thomas just saying, hey, what's going on, man? Thank you for joining us tonight. Hope to hear more of your thoughts surrounding the conversation as this unfolds. Antuhar also says, and yeah, as much as I dig some of what Morrison doing in Green Lantern, I agree that it's a bit too out there for me at this point in time. I might change my mind when things get collected and read in one. Yeah, I totally feel that. Morrison is definitely one of those writers that can read more cohesively once you have the whole picture. Apropos, like the conversation with Hickman, he is very much the same in that way. But you come to a point where you get to some of Morrison's extreme oddity, and it becomes it's kind of unpalatable. And I say that as a fan of Grant Morrison.
Well, you know what I think sometimes, and this will kind of lead into our Batman discussion, because Knight and I were talking about it before we started broadcasting, is that one of his favorite eras, almost a formative era of comics for him and Batman for him, is the Grant Morrison run. And for me, that stuff's borderline unreadable. And I think part of it is, okay, when you talk about Morrison or Hickman or somebody that writes in that style, it's all consuming for them, right? Like that's where their focus is. That's where their creative juices are pointing to. And if you were to just, like, maybe you're a fan of Hickman or maybe you're a fan of Morrison and they're the only writer you read, and when you're not actively reading their comics, if you're thinking about comics, you're thinking about their story and their run. You're ruminating on it, right? So in that way, yeah, maybe you get more out of it. You get more out of it from value, and you get more out of the story, more understanding, because you're invested in it. But if you're somebody like myself or Dark Knight who reads, tens of comics a week, hundreds of comics a month, I literally don't have the brain space to be ruminating on Morrison's Batman run and thinking about what this means and what that means and how does it make sense and how does it tie in. I don't have the time or really the desire to spend that much time thinking about that kind of a story. So yeah, it does make sense that somebody who's investing all that time in it, and Knight, when you first read the Morrison run, it was your introduction into comics and you were all in. You said that to me several times. And so it does make sense that for you enjoyed it, and it was a gateway and it led you to so many other things, whereas somebody who maybe wasn't that invested might have a tougher time. But another thing that illustrates that point, and like Antuhar is saying, when you do read it all in one sitting and it is all you're focused on and the whole story is there for you to read, then yeah, you do enjoy it more. You think, oh yeah, just like, I was saying the Green Lantern stuff, when I read a bigger chunk all at once and I was getting more of the story and it was a little easier to digest, I found I enjoyed it more. And that was the problem. Like when I read the Morrison Batman stuff, I had taken a break from reading comics for several years, and I was just getting back in during that era. And that was kind of a golden age for DC. Like they were coming off Infinite Crisis and Identity Crisis, and everything was clicking really well. Things weren't so great across the street at Marvel. It was a really good time in terms of the creators and the talent they had at DC. So everybody was really excited. And there were a lot of people that were excited about that Batman stuff. And here I am, I'm trying to catch up on everything and trying to, and when I say catch up, I'm talking about years worth of stuff. Okay, what happened? What did I miss? Why is this not making sense? And so for me to have like the extra brain power and time to invest in Morrison was like, no, bro, I just don't have it. And I was never a big fan of him in the first place because I always felt like he was trying to kind of show off. But I will say that I do think, and I said this before, All-Star Superman is spectacular, and that I will always go to bat for Morrison on All-Star Batman, or All-Star Superman rather. But the Batman stuff, I don't know, it just felt so choppy to me. I remember reading issues where him and Damian are in the Batcave, talking about whatever, and then you turn the page and they're like all the way around the world. And so it was a pacing issue, and it was I don't know. It just didn't interest me. A lot of the things he was doing. I'm not a fan of Damian. I didn't like Damian, and that he played a prominent role, obviously in that. So there are a lot of reasons, and to bring it like fully on point with what we're talking about. to me, what Morrison did wasn't, he could have done it with anybody. It wasn't Batman. You know, it wasn't that I think he didn't understand Batman, but who Batman was to Morrison was not who Batman was to me. So it didn't click. And I know you kind of feel the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Morrison very much defined a lot of my understanding of Batman, and especially now as an adult rereading Batman, I very much connect with, a lot of the symbolism, a lot of the theme, and how he chose to portray him. And I think, regarding specifically your issue with the pacing, Morrison, I mean, as you know, likes to take a lot of old school Golden and Silver Age concepts and revitalize them for modern comics. And I think elements of like that pacing, for example, that sort of jump cut from one scene to another is very evocative of old school comics. And maybe, it didn't work well because you were going into this book, reading it with a modern sensibility and expecting a modern sensibility. And, you throw something as kind of dramatic and blunt as a jump cut like that, it might have kind of thrown you for a loop. But I don't know. I appreciate his run even more now that I'm a veteran comic book fan, and now that I know a little bit more about the lore and the mythos that he sort of recovered for the modern age of comics. But with that being said, after about 15 minutes of talking about shit, I will finally intro us into the show. Hey guys, welcome to the 53rd episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all. This week, I am joined by one of the foremost statesmen in the comic book commentary space, my friend Jace from the Comic Source. What's going on, man? I'm very glad to have you on tonight.
Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to this one because I think, let's face it, Superman's my favorite character, but Batman's the character that everybody loves. Batman's a gateway into comic collecting for a lot of people. So I think even if we're not joined by a lot of people live, I think this is going to be one of those videos that make the rounds, and people are going to have something to say, because I think understanding Batman, I think so many people do think they understand them. And my counter to that would be, well, you're talking about who Batman is to you, which is perfectly valid, but I don't know that that's an understanding of who the character is. And I think who the character is has changed over time when you look at eras of the character.
I very much agree. I was actually just having when I was promoting this stream, I had a conversation with somebody, and they were talking about how Batman is deviated from his roots. And I was like, well, that's pretty necessary, right? Because Batman in his origin, first of all, was hanging people off the side of the Batplane and shooting them from point blank range. Aside from the fact that, let's call a spade. When Batman was introduced in 1939, he was a children's character, and he's evolved into an icon of modern American mythology that is more complex and reflects a little bit more of the real world and more of people, and sort of both of our strengths and our pitfalls as a human race. And the great thing about Batman, and one of the things that I appreciate about him, is his versatility. He is a cross-genre character. You can literally do almost any, if not, I would even go as far as removing the word almost from that statement and saying you can do Batman in pretty much any genre and make it work. And it's because he's so complex and because he's so rich. You can take him from a hard-boiled detective story on the streets of Gotham down into the sewers with an underground ritualistic cathedral, up in space with the Justice League, and under the right hands. All of those things can work. And it's interesting because while that is something that I inherently admire about Batman, it is something that a lot of people don't like. You do have a lot of fans that are like, Batman should not be on the Justice League. Batman needs to be in Gotham all the time. And I would kind of make the argument that I think that's a little bit reductive, not allowing the character the space that I think is inherently his, is something that I think he can do. But, before we get into the bulk of the conversation, I do very much want to encourage everybody to go use the link in the description below to go check out Jace's podcast, as well as following him on Twitter. I'll also throw up his Twitter tag as well as mine right now, if you don't get those plugs out of the way for you. But, obviously, I want to start by opening this up with the general statement here on the screen to both, obviously, you, Jace, and everybody who's watching both live and maybe in post. Do people really understand Batman? And you started to approach that question where you kind of subdivide this question into, you know, the individual's Batman versus the general populace's Batman, right? Like how he is portrayed versus how people perceive him. And I think that's very important. And I'm curious, again, this is to Jason, to everybody in the audience. If you were to sort of define Batman within a handful of sentences, how would you define Batman? And do you think it's different from overarching cultural perception of the character?
So I think what's interesting is when you look back at the earliest iterations of Batman, I almost think that he was created out of anger, right? It was a time when there was a lot of injustice and unfairness, and it was almost like a manifestation of, if you gave the disenfranchised agency, this is what they would do, right? They would hang people off sides of buildings, slumlords and things like that. And it was a manifestation of anger. And then as social justice and as times have changed, Batman kind of got away from that, and it kept along in the vein of, like you said, a children's character, and it became a little more campy, throughout, the golden age, where we know some of those stories are just so hokey, and then that continued in the Silver Age, and then obviously with the TV show. So it's almost like when you look at Batman's, evolution, it started here, and then it kind of delved down into something that was much more fantastical and much more fun and lighthearted. And then with Neil Adams and that era of trying to break away from that campiness, that idea of fun and just a character for kids, Rainbow Batman, Batmite, all that kind of stuff that was the legacy of the TV show, with Neil Adams and that more realistic illustration style, with bringing on characters like Ra's al Ghul, you started seeing a more serious side, and it was a more adult Batman, for lack of a better term, and you started getting more of a more sophisticated storytelling style, and delving more into, certainly the Marshall Rogers era, more into the detective and a more cerebral approach for Batman. And that's kind of where he stayed until Frank Miller came along with The Dark Knight Returns, where it's like he took who the modern Batman was, and that serious Batman, that adult Bruce Wayne, because a lot of times in those 70s stories, Bruce Wayne always had a love interest. There was a soap operatic kind of tone to the stories, which I personally attribute to the success of kind of the James Bond films, where you always had a Bond girl. And Bruce Wayne was, supposed to be this at the time millionaire, social playboy and that kind of thing. So that was always an aspect of those stories. Well, what Miller did was he took that aspect, the adult detective part of the story, but reached back far into the past to bring back that edge that Batman had when he first was created, where bring back that anger, bring back that idea of somebody who's looking for vengeance, somebody who does strike fear into the hearts of criminals, and kind of left the Bruce Wayne aspect, the romantic aspect, the Bond aspect, suave millionaire, what have you, kind of left that to the side. So there's not really necessarily room for that, because it's not, now we're not talking about Bruce Wayne, because really when you talk about that Neil Adams era, what it started was, it was bringing agency to Bruce Wayne. It was bringing Bruce Wayne back. And it really was Bruce Wayne who put on this mask of Batman. And what you started to see immediately when Frank Miller came and did Dark Knight Returns, and then year one, was that Bruce Wayne was the mask. Bruce Wayne was the fake character. And what you really had was, from the moment that Bruce Wayne's parents were killed in that alley and the pearls dropped, he became Batman. And Bruce Wayne was the disguise. And so I think that when you talk about an understanding of modern Batman, because again, there have been so many different iterations, but when you talk about understanding who Batman is now, I think that's at the core of the character. What you have to realize is from the time his parents were killed and that person that used to be Bruce Wayne, that young boy at that moment became Batman. And Bruce Wayne kind of ceased to exist in a way because it became all about his mission and all about, I've got to avenge this. I've got to make sure nobody ever goes through this. So Bruce Wayne died in that alley too. And from that moment forward, he's Batman. That's my understanding of Batman. And I fully admit that people may not agree with that and may think I'm wrong, and I very well might be. But to me, that's my understanding of Batman. And that has colored everything that has come since Dark Knight Returns. Because when you read that story, it is so clear that that's Frank Miller's understanding of Batman. Because even in his old age, he can't let go. Even in his old age, the persona of Bruce Wayne doesn't matter. It's a little inconsequential. He's always been Batman from that point forward.
I think that's my
understanding. And I don't know that I could really say if a lot of people agree with that or if that's what people understand about Batman. But I think for the most part, that's who the character is, at least as DC presents him these days. In the comics, I will say, it's a completely different question to understand the character in terms of other media because there's so many different versions.
So I think you have an interesting take, and I actually don't think it's an unpopular take. And I don't totally disagree with you, but I am very much of the moderate opinion that Batman is 100% about a balance between Batman and Bruce Wayne. And I think often the Batman side is on the forefront because, well, I mean, let's be real. Would you rather read a story about Bruce Wayne being Bruce Wayne or Bruce Wayne being Batman, right? You'd rather read a story about Batman. And I think that a lot of Batman's seminal stories include sort of the balancing act between Batman and Bruce Wayne and what happens when he is too much one or the other. And it's mostly, you'll mostly see an exaggeration on more of the Batman than Bruce Wayne side, but it does throw him out of whack. Dark Knight Returns, the thing that caused him, right, to go back to being Batman was that, well, he hadn't been Batman for over, 10 years, right? It had been 10, 15 years. And it was that utter lack of balance that sort of drove this gradient of his emotional and mental state towards re-identifying the Batman persona. I mean, if you look at year one as the starting point to Miller's Batman and Dark Knight Returns, they're the same man, but very different at the same time. And it is in the sense that, year one is him fleshing out Batman. Dark Knight Returns is literally Batman coming back with a vengeance. Batman being deprived of his sort of presence in Bruce Wayne's psyche, and that sort of lack of it allowed for this almost accent of Batman, right? And then it's just full frontal Batman. It's like, if you don't eat fast food for a couple of years, the first time you eat fast food, it's going to fuck up your stomach. It's going to come back with a vengeance. And that's not, the most eloquent metaphor for the sort of Batman persona, but you kind of get what I'm saying here. And you even see elements of that in Batman Ego. You look at Bruce Wayne and Batman as this dichotomy that inherently sort of protect and serve one another in many ways, but are also in a way warring for the consciousness of the same body, right? And you see what happens if either one of those sort of balances are thrown out of whack. So to me, Batman is also very much defined by Bruce Wayne, even if Bruce Wayne isn't explicitly in the story. The fact that Batman exists is very much a product of Bruce Wayne's trauma. I don't think Bruce Wayne died the night his parents were shot. I think his innocence died. And I think there's this common sort of misconception that because his innocence died, that so too did Bruce Wayne. And although that moment irrefutably changed him, I think Bruce Wayne was still very much alive. And the more successful Batman is also the most balanced, right? You see in Grant Morrison's run on Batman, which you don't like, but I do. You start to pull in, elements of the psychology between Batman and Bruce Wayne, and you have him trying to operate as Batman, but also, you know, there is the Bruce Wayne side of him that is now becoming a father, sort of again, but for the first time in a blood relation, and you see it in Jesus, I just lost my train of thought, but you have to, or I look at Batman as the sort of culmination of all of Bruce Wayne's trauma. And I think that saying that Bruce Wayne is not present just because he's not explicitly mentioned or explicitly shown in the book doesn't mean that the character isn't active in that story, that they're not parts of Bruce Wayne that are affecting, you know, the Batman persona. Because, you know, without Bruce Wayne, Batman becomes a monster. You see that sort of posited in stories like Batman Damned. I don't know if you've read it, but you literally see what happens when Bruce Wayne gives up his humanity in order to become Batman, and it doesn't work, right? He becomes this sort of hostile, less ineffectual monster, and you realize that he needs his humanity in order to be the best Batman he can be, and his humanity is very much that side of Bruce Wayne. You know, a lot of stories also hinge upon Bruce Wayne struggling to find that balance, but I think it also articulates why that sort of seesaw of the Batman and Bruce Wayne personas is so relevant, and why you really cannot have one without the other.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting as we talk about this, and it's such a complex question because you talk about, you know, do you understand Batman? I agree with you, but you know, when I look at the books, I can't help but think, well, he's always in the cowl, he's always in the mask. Those are the stories they write because apparently those are the stories that the creators want to tell, and those are the creators that are selling stories. But I look back at my favorite eras of Batman, it is before Frank Miller's Year One. It's before Dark Knight Returns. And it is the, you know, the late 70s, early 80s where Bruce Wayne was so much more a part of the narrative. But I feel like that's not what's necessarily being given to us these days, because I do agree with you. Some of the most seminal stories, some of the stories in recent times that I've enjoyed the most, like Tom Taylor's, I think it was Batman, it might have been Detective Annual, but the Father's Day episode or issue that was so good, when he kind of, you know, came to realize, hey, Alfred's really been my father, you know, all along. It was poignant, it was emotional, it was really, really great. But, you know, and I do agree with you as far as maybe Bruce Wayne didn't die in that alley. Maybe it really is Batman that's the mask that he's used to create this persona that is now protecting that little boy.
Yeah.
But it's clear to me that the character of Bruce Wayne and Batman, there currently isn't a balance, and there isn't a reconciliation, at least not in the way the stories are being presented now, because we don't get enough, I think, of Bruce Wayne. And I think that in the hands of the right creator, it could be good. And I think Tom King tried to give us that with the bat and cat thing, trying to show us that, you know, the romantic side. But it didn't work for, you know, a number of reasons, at least for me. A lot of it had to do with pacing, and a lot of that might have been due to editorial from my understanding, from, you know, things I've heard and conversations I've had with Tom. So, you know, it just is what it is now. I mean, he's such a popular character, and people want the action, and they want, you know, Bruce Wayne under the cowl. And so there are times where I think that Bruce Wayne running Wayne Enterprises or Wayne Tech, that sort of storyline could be good, but we don't get enough of it. Bruce Wayne, in terms of, I like it better when his love interest is not, I don't want somebody who's in that same world. You know, I just want him to have a regular person, you know? And it doesn't need to go so far as some person who doesn't have any idea he's Batman, you know, more of like a Clark and Lois relationship maybe. But that's the thing. It's that Batman is so popular, and there are so many creators that get to work on all the time, that the narrative does, and who he is as a character, it does get so muddy. And it's what makes this question so tough to answer, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, so here I kind of want to attack what you just said there, under something I'd mentioned prior, and it is kind of what is explicitly involving Bruce Wayne and what is implicitly involving Bruce Wayne, and perhaps it's that side of me that is like the wannabe creator, that is looking for things to admire about this character. But I very much find that Batman is 100% defined by Bruce Wayne. I don't think, I think that even though you may have many stories where Bruce Wayne does not take off the cowl, where Bruce Wayne does not go off and do something without the suit, I still very much think that, without Bruce, there is no Batman. Batman is sort of the defense mechanism that the 8-year-old Bruce Wayne established for himself and for, you know, any other person that could potentially become the victim that he was. And to me, I very much see Bruce Wayne always implicitly a part of Batman. Bruce Wayne's wants and desires are Batman's wants and desires because Batman was created by Bruce Wayne's psyche. And I think that's where it kind of starts to boil down to a lot of questions as to what needs to be explicitly on the page and what has been developed over time. How is our understanding reflecting sort of that dichotomy between Batman and Bruce, right? Because, you know, Batman, I just don't think that Bruce Wayne needs to be on a panel of a book without the cowl on for Bruce Wayne's character and for his wants and his desires and his faux pas to be exhibited in the story. Batman's flaws are Bruce Wayne's flaws. Batman not wanting to kill is a reflection of Bruce Wayne losing his parents and resenting people who kill. Right? Like
Mm.
Batman's defining absolutism to completely abolish crime is a product of a scared and wounded 8-year-old boy who doesn't really know how else to handle all of that trauma and all of that sadness except to try and prevent that from happening to anybody else. So I very much think that Bruce Wayne doesn't need to be explicitly part of a story for Bruce Wayne to actually be in the story. Because again, although you might have, the sort of balance shifting in one direction or the other, and I'll give you the credit that I think it's very much shifted more towards Batman than Bruce. I think Bruce is still always present in any Batman story you read. And if there's no hint of that whatsoever, I think that is a product of bad writing, and I think it's a product of an unconscious editorial because, again, I feel like you should always be able to point to a Batman story, no matter what it is, and say, there's Bruce Wayne coming through. It could be in a moment, it could be in a scene, it could be in multiple pages, but you should always be able to find a moment that says, this scene, this action, this thought is defined by Bruce Wayne in some way, just as much as it is defined by Batman. And with that being said, I do want to get into some of these live chats because we do have a couple of gentlemen here joining us with some really great thoughts. Samoki Dude just says, "Yo, what's up, boys? What's going on, man? Thank you for popping in." We also have a generous donation to the channel from Aaron VO, and I'll just share the comment with you guys here. He just says, support your boy. Should be a good one tonight. I appreciate your support. I appreciate you promoting to support the channel. It's very kind, and I very much think that it has been a great conversation, and I think it will continue to be thanks to my conversational partner tonight. Damian Wayne says, really looking forward to Decan's take on the Dark Knight. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I am not because I live with it every day, but hopefully somebody can get some enjoyment out of it. And we have a couple of folks chiming in on what Batman is to them. And Samoki Dude says, Batman is so many things. He's a broken and traumatized man. He's a strong warrior, but also he's a man. He is a man who sacrifices his life, love, friends, and personality to his mission. I think that's certainly a part of it. But I think as much as he sacrifices some joys of life to the mission, I very much find that as Batman fulfilling something very important in himself, because when people talk about it as a mission, it feels more like a job or an obligation. Batman's mission is inherently something that is sort of encoded in who he is as a person, and it is almost an instinct to a degree that he needs to accomplish. So while I think he sacrifices, I think, some of the, I don't want to call them luxuries of life, but he sacrifices I would say
He
maybe,
sacrifices normalcy. He has no
yeah,
chance at a normal life.
for sure. He that's the perfect way to put it. He sacrifices normalcy for the sake of his own inclinations and because of his kind of altruism in his motives. I mean, do you, Jace, do you feel like Bruce Wayne is? Do you think the fact that Bruce Wayne is defined by his trauma is a detriment to him as a character? Or do you think that it is more overwhelmingly good for not only the character to be able to sort of reflect his trauma into altruism? And do you also think it's just worth it enough to provide, the story potential through that trauma?
Well, yeah, I think that's the biggest impact of it is the story potential, because it is so interesting that somebody would take this event that happened and turn it into their whole life. So I think the story potential there is huge. And then I think as far as impact on the world, when you want to talk about altruism, it has a great impact. And it is an overall positive for the vast majority of people whose lives are affected by Batman. If you take it as, is it a positive for Bruce Wayne? Then no, I think it's 100% a negative for him, because he has sacrificed any chance for normalcy. And I think for me, like, I think a fundamental difference when you and I look at the character is you always see Bruce Wayne, under the cowl.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at Bruce Wayne, I don't see, when I look at Batman, I see Batman.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I kind of see Bruce Wayne, when you talk about him as a character, who could he be? What could his happiness have been? We do see glimpses of that in certain stories.
Mm-hmm.
But when I see any kind of agency for Bruce Wayne coming through when he's Batman, I kind of think of that as more an exception rather than a rule, or just the fact that it's his past bleeding through a little bit. Because to me, when you talk about Bruce Wayne, when I talk about wanting to see Bruce Wayne in a story, what I'm talking about is, let's get a glimpse of what might have happened had his parents not died. To me, that's what I, so for me, and because of my understanding and my take on it, with thinking that, maybe let's not say Bruce Wayne died in the alley. Let's say Bruce Wayne's chance for a normal life died in that alley.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting, because it is so dichotomous to look at, where Batman is now, what Bruce Wayne's life has become, what Batman's life has become, however you want to label him. Let me get some glimpses into Bruce Wayne having a chance at happiness, having a chance at normalcy, even if it's for a page or a panel or two, and contrast that with who he is as Batman, because it does, again, bring close to the surface the idea of the sacrifice and what he is giving up, and how heroic Batman is as a character. And I think for me, that's what I love the best about Tom King's run, because I think that's what Tom was trying to examine with the Bat-Cat relationship. And ultimately, it's what tore them apart in Batman 50, was Catwoman realizing, hey, I can't take this away from the world. He does too much good. And if he's happy, then you were going down that path, right? You were heading down the path to say, here's happiness. Here's what might have happened for Bruce had his parents not been killed, but that removes the agency from Batman. And again, that's a whole nother multiple hour podcast breaking down Tom King's run. But I think it gets back to the question of yes, it is complex. He is a complex character. It is really rich, because there's so many of these different angles that you can explore.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, when it comes down to is do people understand Batman? We may not be able to come up with a definitive answer because he is so many things to so many different people based on what's your entry point to him. Where does Batman start and Bruce Wayne end? And are they the same people? It seems like to you they are much more. Bruce Wayne is Batman. Batman is Bruce Wayne. To me, they're much more separate in my mind. I see them as almost separate entities. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the relationship between Batman and Bruce Wayne has evolved, right? I think that at one point it very much was Batman becoming this way to shelter and protect that hurt and traumatized 8-year-old boy. But I think as Bruce Wayne has grown, he's sort of intellectualized his own trauma, right? We're starting to see a lot of stories now where Batman's very self-aware of his trauma, and I think that he acknowledges that in a way, I, I don't. I think that he consciously prevents himself from healing his wounds completely because he knows that it's what drives him, right? He knows that.
Angst.
I don't know if it's an angst. I think he needs to feel the pain, right? I think that pain is what drives him. That it's what allows him to sympathize with the victims of crime in the world. It allows him to there's something about like sympathy and sort of being able to take somebody else's pain and feel it for yourself. Because I think not only does it develop a very true and pure sentiment, but it allows you to not only understand them, but I think relate to them in a way that will strengthen your resolve. And that is especially pertinent to Batman. And I think we have seen him grow as he's become more of a father figure to the Bat family. I mean, I've talked about this many times, how I think that, writers writing Batman as a bad dad is a fucking horrible misunderstanding of the character. Because I think that Batman becoming a good dad is actually the next step in his evolution. He's taken his pain as a child, at the specific sort of criminal loss of his parents, and has affected his war on crime. But now, how does Batman take his trauma at the lack of the parental figure and the loss of those vital parental figures and become the best parent he can be for these orphaned kids who are very much in similar positions he was? And how does he redefine his trauma in that way to prevent that sort of that I would say that familial damage that these kids are facing? I think that it is very much something that should be important to Batman Bruce Wayne, and I hope we'll see more writers taken in that direction. If not, I'm going to look at the camera right now. If it's not, if I ever get the chance to write Batman, that would be a huge focus on something I would do. It would be about the family, because for the biggest loner in comics, he has the most extensive network of family and friends out there. And while I think Batman sort of prefers to keep them out of his vigilantism for their own safety, I think that he acknowledges how much they have helped him grow past his trauma, and to take, that sort of emotionally stunted man and how they've allowed him to evolve and change and sort of reconcile with his trauma. This conversation is so very complex, and I don't think anything I'm going to say is really going to do it any justice, to be quite frank, because Batman Bruce Wayne has evolved into such a staple in not only American mythology but global mythology. You can go to any third world country and wearing a Batman t-shirt, and I guarantee you 9 out of 10 people will understand what that symbol means. And along the lines of what Jace was saying, it might mean something slightly different to everybody, right? Like you might have one person that says, that they see hope. You might have another person that says that they see sort of the necessity to push past adversity. so on and so forth. But they all stand for something very kind of vital and elemental, right? Um, and that's what's allowed him to permeate the culture of the world at large. I I think though, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the conversation. There are some actual misunderstandings of Batman that I would be more than happy to sort of tear down. One of them, particularly, being the way they reduce Batman down to a rich guy who beats the shit out of, the mentally unhealthy or the mentally ill and the poor. I think reducing him down to that does obviously the character a disservice, but whoever makes those sentiments, or whoever verbalizes those sentiments, I think it does them a complete disservice to not see the character for what he's worth. But it's very difficult to sort of pin Batman down to anything strictly because, he's had an 80-year continuity. The reins of the character are constantly in flux. Within the last 5 years, we've seen 3 writers completely define an era of Batman. And I would say to some degrees, they can be a little bit contradictory. So it does kind of make this conversation simultaneously difficult to have, but I think it gives it a lot of legs.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, he doesn't have the kind of that straight throughput from his earliest origins that Superman has, where, he's always been an inspiration and a symbol of hope and that kind of thing. Because when you talk about Batman, it's so rooted in psychology, right? Like, so I was a psychology major in college, and when you talk about what you were just saying, Knight, about the fact that here's a guy who's taken his pain and the trauma that he went through, and he relives it constantly by being empathetic with other people who are being faced with injustice, and he wants to be sure that nobody ever has to go through that level of pain that he went through of losing his parents. So he holds on to that, right? And purely from a psychological standpoint, that is so unhealthy. The fact that you can't move past trauma that's happened to you, the fact that you maybe blame yourself, survivor's guilt, those things are so incredibly unhealthy. And it would lead to somebody who has as long of a career as Batman to complete insanity and, breakdown. And then when you talk about not being able to be a good father, the way some characters or creators rather have portrayed him, it could be a manifestation of that. I mean, I don't know. I think, again, I think that's reductive as well. And you're neglecting to showcase the heroic aspect that's at the core of Bruce Wayne, no matter what kind of view or take that you have on why he does what he does.
Yeah,
at his core, Bruce Wayne, Batman, whatever label you want to put on him, he is a hero, and he maybe he comes close to the line sometimes, maybe even steps over the line sometimes, but it always comes from a place of wanting to make the world a better place for everybody, disenfranchised or otherwise. And so I think if you are just portraying him as a bad father for the sake of drama and service to the story to create tension, then yes, you're being completely reductive, and it's a bad storytelling. It's worse than bad storytelling. It's a lazy storytelling to use that as a crutch to bring in drama, because at the end of the day, Bruce Wayne does what he does. Batman does what he does because of family, because of familial obligation. And he does have a large family now. The Bat family is extensive. And as much as he loved his parents, as much as he cares about his parents, as much as he won't let go of his pain, as unhealthy as that is, that's all because of his parents. Now you're telling me when he has an extended family, he's going to mistreat them?
Right.
Are you kidding? That's completely contradictory to the character. So just don't go there, creators. It's that simple.
Well, aside from the fact that, one of the arguments for that a lot of people make is that he didn't have a guidance to be a good father. He had fucking Alfred.
Yeah.
Alfred, for my money. And as somebody who is now studying English literature, Alfred is the greatest supporting character of all time.
Yep.
Alfred is one of the best dads in all of fiction. Batman, Bruce Wayne, whatever you want to call him, had the perfect father figure in Alfred.
Yep.
And and we see some stories like you'd mentioned with like that Tom Taylor issue, and even that moment in Batman issue 50 where he acknowledges Alfred as a father figure and how much Alfred has contributed to him just as an overall human being. It is astounding to me when Bruce Wayne does not give it his all to be a good father, because Bruce Wayne recognizes how Alfred saved him. Batman does not exist without Alfred Pennyworth. Fuck, Bruce Wayne would not exist without Alfred Pennyworth. And it speaks volumes to me that, you know, Batman isn't portrayed as a good father. It's fundamentally a misunderstanding of the character in multiple ways. One, because he has the guidance figure and he's been doing this long enough and has actually explicitly acknowledged how important Alfred was to his development. But also, aside from the fact that, you know, Bruce Wayne has this absolute unyielding war on crime because of something that he had experienced, right? It is him fighting against the tragedy that befell him from befalling other people. You know what part of that tragedy was? Losing parents. Batman, you know, as a father, and I think parents are inherently heroes. And I think you can speak volumes on this because you're a father yourself. In the eyes of a child, you know, a good parent is a hero. And if Batman is one of the greatest superheroes of all time, and especially one whose war on crime stems from loss, and part of that loss, and a majority of that loss, is defined by his departure of his relationship with his parents, then why the hell would Batman not wage a war, or why would he not wage a sort of mission on being a great parent to these children that he has taken in the same way that he has waged a war on the crime that took his parents away from him? Because I think that is vitally important. And it's not to say that Batman wouldn't mess up, right? I very much think that Bruce Wayne would make a lot of mistakes because he is hard-headed, and he might take Alfred's lessons and try to make them his own rather than living specifically by Alfred's lessons. And I get that. And that's where you can not be a lazy writer and actually draw drama out of the experience of Batman just struggling to do something that is inherently ridiculously difficult to do, right? Like, I'm 23. I don't plan on having kids anytime soon, but I can acknowledge how difficult it is to be a good parent. And to me, you know, there is not a day that goes by that Bruce Wayne would not lose sleep over reconsidering his mistakes as a parent and trying to fix those things. And you see them present in like Batman and Robin by Peter Tomasi, which is one of the most brilliant fucking Batman stories of the last decade, easily. And that is 100% defined by Batman making mistakes as a parent, but trying unyieldingly to become sort of, you know, the figure to his son that Alfred was to him. Sorry, I went off on a rant, but I get very passionate about that.
No, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think, like I said, I think it's lazy writing. So, or just maybe they don't have an idea, or maybe they haven't sat around and thought about it as much as we have. So, yeah.
And with that being said, before we kind of move on into the next segment of the conversation, I've fallen vitally behind on some of these live chats, so let's breeze through a couple of these. Aaron VO says, to me, Batman is still the boy in the alley. He never grew past the tragedy of his parents' death. Batman deals in absolute justice versus injustice, same as a child would see the world, in black and white. Adult Bruce Wayne is a facade. Inside, I see Batman as a child in many ways. And I think I sort of half agree with you and I sort of half don't, Aaron. And where I do is that I very much agree, and I've said it already within the contents of this conversation, that Batman is 100% defined by the absolutism of a child trying to vanquish his own monsters, That is a defining feature of Batman. The thing that I will say is that I think Bruce Wayne, especially well into his career as Batman, has become self-aware enough and has grown enough to recognize what he's doing with his pain and how he's acting on it. And I think that he chooses in a way not to heal because that mission is so inherently embedded into who he is as a person now that he knows that in order to be an effective Batman, he needs to feel that pain. He needs to empathize with the people that he's saving because it drives him. It causes this very visceral emotional reaction. And I think I can speak for anybody, in saying that you will never be as good at something as when you will never be more capable at something than when you are emotionally invested in what you're doing. And it very much speaks volumes for something as extreme as Batman's war on crime. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Jace? Are you?
No,
Are
I mean,
you?
I tend to agree with you. I think that going back to what I said before, that's where the heroism comes in, right? Like we know how unhealthy it is, and you're right. In recent years, creators have given Bruce Wayne that awareness, that self-awareness that he hasn't had maybe ever before in the history of Batman stories. He knows it's unhealthy. He knows what he's sacrificing. And to go back to the Tom King run, it was what was so interesting about the fact that he was maybe for the first time in his life going to be a little selfish in terms of, hey, let me find a little bit of happiness. And ultimately, Selena loved him too much to allow him to do that, because she knew eventually the guilt of that, I think she knew it would have eaten him alive. And so, yeah, I agree with you. With that self-awareness, he knows it's unhealthy. He knows ultimately it's going to lead to his downfall, but he still embraces the pain. He still accepts that this is the mission he's given himself, so that nobody else is going not only have to go through the trauma he went through, but have to continually embrace that pain that keeps him motivated.
100%.
So yeah, I do agree that ultimately the formation of Batman was based on the absolute of justice versus injustice, fairness versus, unfairness. But I think, yeah, he has evolved past that as a character, both in terms of a literary character and a character in pop culture, as well as the actual character in the stories. I think has evolved. He's more complex than that now, I think.
Yeah. I mean, when Batman is, and I said this at the open to this conversation, he is one of the most complex and versatile characters in all of fiction. Not just comic books. You can tell so many different stories on the back of the fact that he's just a character filled with so much agency that it's almost believable, that Batman is in space or on the streets of Gotham or in this sort of ritual ground for something crazy and supernatural, but also because of that emotional complexity, right? There are so many different ways you can interpret Batman's mission, although I think there are generally through lines that most conscious Batman fans will acknowledge. But when you have something so emotionally complex, a lot of people will take certain aspects, right, to that and kind of allow themselves to feel those more than others, and that's where you'll get these kind of varying interpretations if they connect to the character on that sort of spiritual level. Smoky Dude says he feels that many people get Batman wrong in many ways, and I agree. Hence, this conversation. He is not an asshole who wants to work alone, but he usually wants to work alone because he doesn't want his friends to get hurt, and I agree. I think that's certainly a big part of it. I think it's less about Batman being concerned with other people fucking up his mission more than it is that he doesn't want, he doesn't want people to feel the same pain he does, and hence cannot let him into his mission because his mission is defined by pain. So I very much connect with you there. John Thomas says, to me, Batman is conflicted, sworn to uphold the oath he has taken whilst looking for personal happiness he may never find. And I think, Jace kind of commented on that very much by discussing like Tom King's Batman run. And that's certainly a very present thing. And especially in, again, Jace's aforementioning about 70s and 80s Batman, where, Bruce's love interests do become very much part of the sort of driving force behind those Batman stories. So, you know, I very much think though that Batman is very willing to sacrifice his personal happiness, and it's interesting to me because I think that he views his mission as such a necessity that he doesn't see it as sacrifice. You know, I think Bruce Wayne sees it as necessary. I think he sees it just as
Reality.
necessary. Right. I think he sees it as something just as necessary as, you know, physically working out every day in order to be the best Batman he can be. It's just a tactical thing. I don't know. What do you feel about that, Jace?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's his reality, and I don't think he gives it where the character has progressed to and evolved to now. I don't think he gives it a second thought. It was a little different back, you know, in the 70s and 80s, where, you know, he kind of would acknowledge it and think, oh, you know, I'm in the middle of this dinner with this person, and now I've got to get up and go be Batman. And it was a little more kind of in the forefront. Now he wouldn't give it a second thought. You know, it's again that Frank Miller influence of such dedication and driving force of who the character is. I will say it'll be real interesting to see what. I mean, we all know that Tom King didn't finish his plan. He was going to do 100 issues of Batman, not up to issue 100. He was going to write. His goal was to write 100 issues of Batman solitary. And we know that he wrote a couple of the Night of the Monsters with, I think, Steve Orlando, and then he had a couple of issues that he was supposed to write called The Price with Joshua Williamson, and then Williamson ended up writing those solo while King was over doing some Hollywood stuff. So then it got pushed out. He was going to write it to like 107 or what have you, and then editorial decisions and politics of comics or whatever, and he got moved off of it. So he didn't get to finish telling the story he planned on telling. He went through the City of Bane, and then that was it, and we didn't get the resolution with Bruce and Selina. So that's what the Bat and Cat miniseries is going to be. It's going to take a little while because Clay Mann's drawing the entire thing, and Clay Mann can be kind of slow because his art is so detailed. But I've heard conflicting things, like, yes, it's going to be in continuity. No, it's not going to be in continuity. I don't think we'll know until it comes out, and DC may not even have made up their mind. Maybe they don't know where the line's going to be. Knight and I were talking about, you know, what happens after Dark Knight Metal before we started broadcasting and you know, wondering. So they may not have a decision on that yet. And it may come down to how it's received. And so for me, that could go a lot toward what John is saying here. Trying to be Batman while looking for personal happiness. Well, it all depends on what editorial wants. Do they want to bring back that aspect of the character? Or are we going to kind of sweep that aspect of King reintroducing that concept kind of under the rug and just sort of forget about it? Because it was so prominent in what, like 15, 20 issues leading up to 50. It was that question, is this what's going to happen? And when you talk about the self-awareness and the guilt, that's all about War of Jokes and Riddles, right? We saw that so present with Bruce saying, I don't even deserve to marry you, Selina, because look what I did here after I already was Batman. And granted, it was early on in my career, but so much of what King was trying to explore. But I think, you know, you talk about me not liking Morrison. I think sometimes King doesn't explain things well enough for somebody who doesn't want to sit there and think about it. Like I was talking before, maybe you read too many books. So I think sometimes Tom doesn't put the ideas and topics he wants to explore. They're not explicit enough for some people. And so, you know, I know ultimately it all comes down to sales. There were so many people that didn't like what King was doing on the book. But when we sit here and we talk about these concepts that seem to interest people, it's so much of what Tom King was trying to do. But I think it just wasn't overt enough for people to catch on to. So I'm very curious to see, in terms of what John Thomas is talking about here, ultimately, what is the story? What do we get out of Bat and Cat? And is it going to be in continuity or not? How might it or might it not affect Batman going forward? So yeah. I mean, I'm even looking forward to that series, Knight.
I'm not. I'm pretty disenfranchised with his portrayal of Batman because I think Tom King has very much found a focal point of Batman at which he will focus on almost exclusively, and I think he's blown it up to such a degree that he's starting to. It's like when you try to take like a picture and you zoom in and you zoom in and you zoom in and you zoom in, and then it starts to become really pixelated. And the more you zoom in, the muddier the waters get, and the less definition there is, even though you're zooming in to try to kind of define the point. But I actually did like Tom King's Batman run for the first 20 issues, 20 something issues or so, and then it really started to fall off. I think he does actually have some pretty crucial misunderstandings of the character, as much as he's shown some very solid sort of connection to the character as well. But over the course of his 80 something issue run, I think he's shown significantly more of a misunderstanding than an understanding. Aside from the fact that I do think that Tom King writes a very esoteric Batman, which I don't think is the way to handle Batman. And don't get me wrong, a lot of my favorite writers are a little bit esoteric and a little bit more like individually defined by sort of very specific things. But I think Tom King being overly esoteric tied to, I think, some misunderstandings of Batman. And there's also an element of Tom King saying, I'm going to define Batman, rather than him trying to take a part of Batman and exhibit it. You know what I'm saying? He tries to make characters his rather than trying to write for the character. And I don't think it works with someone like Batman. And I think that's why his run critically, aside from just my own opinion, critically started to fall off after about 20 or 30 issues. And once you get to the end of that run, it really did sort of limp into really not even the finish line. So
yeah, I mean, I kind of, I mean, as much as I love Tom and his work, I kind of agree with you. I think, and he's even said it himself, like he knew when he was coming on Batman, he wanted to tell the Bruce and Selina love story, and he wanted to tell a Bane story. Dude, you were planning on writing 100 issues of Batman. You got to give us more than that. That's like 2 arcs in the way comics work these days, maybe 4, But I agree with you. He was too hyper focused on a couple of particular aspects. I don't necessarily agree that he misunderstands the character. I think that he didn't, because he was so hyper focused on those 2 aspects, that he didn't bother to explore the other aspects, and that could lead to an impression of he doesn't care about that or he doesn't know about that. I think he was just his focus was too narrow for the length of run that he wanted to tell.
I agree. I think it pretty much he put on like blinders, and he was so focused on one part of Batman that he failed to show all of these other kind of important and complexities of the character, so that by the time you get to the end of the run and it's so streamlined into this one specific angle of the character, you sort of lack that nuance and you lack that complexity, and it feels very one-sided. So I actually, as you explain that, I do very much agree with that. Tom King's a smart fucking guy. Tom King's a real smart guy, and he's a good writer. As much as I have very much shared my distaste of his Batman, I just think that because Batman is so rich and complex, that you need to show that richness and that complexity, rather than just focusing on one part of him, because it's not any one part of him that makes him important or special. It is that culmination of all of those things that has made him such an enduring figure.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the sales numbers, that's borne out. Like, it started off really well, but then people just got tired of it. Like, the finish line was too far away.
Yeah. I agree. You make a very, very solid point there, that I can certainly agree with, for sure. Samoki Dude says that he doesn't think that Bruce and Batman are separate personalities, like he disassociates. They're the same person, but different facets of his personality. Yeah, I'd agree. I very much think that Bruce Wayne tries to disassociate Bruce Wayne and Batman. And you see that brought to the extreme in a story like Batman Damned, where he literally sacrifices Bruce Wayne in order to become Batman. but I don't think it's successful. And I think, you know, in these later years, he's become increasingly aware of it. Do you think, Jace, do you think he's actively trying to disassociate? And would it be me overstepping to say that I feel like you would agree that he does successfully kind of disassociate Batman and Bruce Wayne a little bit?
Yeah, I think in his mind, he does kind of what I do when he thinks about Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is more about the concept of Bruce Wayne is more about what might have been. You know, like we saw in the alternate, you know, reality story with where his parents were still alive right before the wedding. To him, I think to him, when he thinks about Bruce Wayne, it's more about who I might have been. So yes, I'm still Bruce Wayne, but it's almost like I'm Bruce Wayne Batman. It's all one. So in that way, some Okie dude is right. He's now Bruce Wayne Batman. When we talk about just Bruce Wayne, to me, that's more about the potential of what might have been. So in my mind, at least the way I approach it is they are almost like two different people. It's the loss of what might have been for Bruce Wayne had that not happened. And at that moment, he became Bruce Wayne Batman. So yes, he is still Bruce Wayne, to kind of change a little bit of what I was saying before, a little bit of the perspective of it. He became the Bruce Wayne that Batman is an inherent part of, as opposed to Bruce Wayne that followed in his father's footsteps, ran Wayne Enterprises, got married, had kids, you know, whatever. So yeah, I kind of see it both ways. And I think we've had different storytellers that have given us that perspective where what might have been. And that goes back to the roots of the character with the tragedy of what happened in the alley.
Yeah. See, one thing I find interesting is that I think that Batman is so involved with, you know, his motivations and with his war on crime that I don't think he considers what might have been. Actually, I think that's more.
He very, very rarely does, which is why when it's done well, it is so impactful.
I agree. I think you see a lot more of that in Alfred. I think Alfred very much laments the loss of Bruce Wayne's innocence, and he sees it, you know, in who Bruce is day to day, being Batman, and he
confronts Bruce with it at various times. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And I think that's where you begin to see a little bit of that, like, lamentation of Bruce's innocence, because I think, you know, at this point, and you bring up a very good point about how Frank Miller kind of shifted Batman into this much more militant force, this much more James Bond-esque machine. Like I within the last year read the original Casino Royale, and it's astounding how much you can see Batman being influenced in the modern age by, I would say, James Bond, but I would say Batman is a little bit more self-aware than Bond is, but you see a lot of those features, and Batman now, I think, sees the loss of his innocence as a necessity to him becoming the soldier, you know, to becoming this force against evil and corruption. That, you know, I think it's moreover Alfred kind of looking from the outside in, seeing, man, it is with great sorrow that I acknowledge that, you know, in order for this man to become something so pure and so good, that he has to have lost so much. But yeah, it certainly brings up a really interesting part of this conversation. Comic Breakdown says, late but here, welcome, man. Glad you could join us. Hope to get a little bit of your thoughts here in the live conversation. And I think apropos of my rant on how much I love Alfred, John Thomas says, agreed, Alfred is the man, which
no argument here.
No disagreements on either side here. Ant Too Hard chimes in saying, I always felt that Bruce Timm and Alan Burnett, Paul Dini, managed to get Batman right, aside from the Tommaso Police, that he's a man that's trying to utilize his pain to do better and protect his family. Yeah, I think that, you know, it is just Bruce Wayne trying to protect people from the evils that have hurt him. And part of that, you know, is becoming a good father. And you see a lot of that in Batman the Animated Series, although, you know, a little bit watered down. And that's not discrediting that show, because I absolutely adore Batman the Animated Series. And I think it kind of complexifies Batman to the younger audience in such a way that had never been done before. And it's actually probably what drove my love of the character so much, because although I was born in 97 and that show started in 92, my favorite thing was getting up on Saturday mornings and watching reruns of that cartoon and absolutely losing myself in that world. And at the time, not being able to explain it, but feeling, the complexities of this character and of his world and of his mission that he lives by. It is so good. I mean, I don't know. Do you feel like how do you feel about the Batman the Animated Series portrayal of the character and his mythos, and even going as far as that dichotomy between Batman and Bruce? Because you see that, I forget the name of the episode, but when he has those dreams of
of what might have been, yeah,
right, and
I think it's a good introductory way to learn about Batman, but I don't think the complexity is there, and that's completely fine, because at the end of the day, it's a kid's cartoon, and I think the quality of it, the quality of the voice acting in it, obviously the animation, the style and the tone they chose. I mean, everything was just pitch perfect. They really captured lightning in a bottle, and it really became this all ages experience. And so I think it is a great way to learn about the character. But no, I don't think that it really ever explores kind of to the depth or the seriousness that we're talking about it here when it comes to Batman, and it shouldn't. It's very much its own thing, and I think it serves its purpose. And if somebody wants to go and learn more and have a more mature take on Batman and read more mature stories, then that's what the comics are for. So I do agree that they captured what I'll call the spirit of the character perfectly well. They didn't, explore kind of the angst or the psychological parts of it, and rightly so. They shouldn't be exploring those things in a cartoon. So, I've had an opportunity to interview a lot of those people involved over the years with the cartoon, from Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, Kevin Conroy, and they all know and acknowledged, even at the time, by the halfway through season 1, they realized that they were all part of something really, really special, and they're all humbled by the fact that it's still going strong after so long. I did an interview with a lot of them for the 25th anniversary in 2018 at New York Comic Con, and to this day they're still all like super grateful and super humble and very proud of it. So that cartoon will stand the test of time and go down in my mind as one of the greatest animated series of all time.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually at that panel at New York Comic Con, the 25th anniversary. It was. Yeah,
we were at the show together. Didn't even know it.
Yeah, I know, right? That's kind of crazy. Hopefully, man, when the world opens up, we'll actually be able to be at a show and know about it.
Yeah, that'll be a good time. Take you around and introduce you to a lot of creators you haven't had a chance to meet yet.
I'm here for it. I really, I know there's a lot of like stigma going around for BarCon, but like, and it could just be me 100% being aware that as a man, I don't feel threatened by that atmosphere. But like, I'm actually kind of excited to just go out to a bar and like get drunk and talk about comic books with people who make them. It just
I'd be like, hey, so this guy, he has a YouTube channel. He complains about your stuff all the time. I'd like you to meet him.
and then there's just drunk me walking up to them and be like, okay, so let me tell you why you're wrong. Like, with full confidence. Let's see here. We also have Silver Batman Ranger that says Batman is an example to his sidekicks and other younger heroes of overcoming pain and hurt and still deciding to do good as best as you can. Like a hope in a very different way than Superman. I agree that he's a very different hope than Superman. But I think, frankly, the first half of your statement is a little bit limiting. Batman is an example to everybody to overcome their pain and to overcome their adversity, and not just doing the best that you can. Batman, because of his sort of absolute nature, is never satisfied with the best that you can. There's this beautiful arc, and I reviewed it and loved it. It was Peter Tomasi's first arc on Detective Comics before they hit the 1000th issue. And that last issue, number 999 of Detective Comics, Batman was talking about it doesn't end until crime is at absolute zero. So to me, and it's proven, I think, in a lot of the iterations of Batman that I'm most fond of, that Batman is not satisfied with doing the best he can. Batman was only satisfied when the tragedy is no longer required, or when the pain is no longer required to fuel his war. He has to win the war absolutely and completely. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Jace? Is there a little bit more of a compromise, or are you more on my end where, Bruce Wayne is more about, fighting until the very end, knowing that it is a war he cannot win, rather than just doing the best he can?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's why I always kind of roll my eyes when we hear about these last Batman stories. There's never a last Batman story, because at the end of the day, you can't defeat what is the worst in humanity. It's always going to exist. It's part of our species. And so there is no last Batman story. Bruce Wayne, Batman, he will go down fighting till his absolute last breath. There simply is no last Batman story, and there is no compromise. He never, ever will stop until justice is the only thing that exists, and we know that's just not possible. So,
and that's one of the things I really liked about the last half of Snyder's New 52 Batman run, was that Batman goes as far as to set up a system where, really he is feeling pain for all of eternity in order to continue to launch this sort of infinite war on crime by cloning himself. And there's a tragedy in that, right? In that willingness to feel pain for an eternity in order to use that pain as fuel to prevent other people from facing that same sort of that same sort of trauma and that same sort of hurt. And that's super, super powerful. And that is very much a comment.
It's super dark too, because when I go back to what I was saying earlier about how unhealthy it is, it's like his pain is a bottomless pit that can never be filled up, to the point that he's never going to let himself retire. It's never going to be enough. It's never going to be, I saved X number of lives, and now I can finally rest. There is no rest in Batman. There's no quit. There's no compromise. And maybe really, when you want to talk about understanding the character or something that defines him, that might be the best way to put it of anything that we've talked about. There's no compromise. There's no quit. There's no rest ever. I mean, Bruce Wayne will die, go to heaven or hell, whatever, and he'll still be wearing the costume and still be trying to fight crime in whatever manner it exists there.
Right.
Still looking for justice.
100%. I agree. And again, if you guys want a really great Batman story that just puts that on full display, I would check out the Batman story Mythology by Peter Tomasi and Doug Menck. It collects Detective Comics number 994 to 999. It's just before the 1000th issue. I adore that arc, and it very much puts on display how, pun intended, I guess, eternal Batman is, and how he will never stop his war on crime until it's over, and he acknowledges that it will never be over. So, there's that. Aaron Vio says, and I think this was regarding us kind of connecting Batman and James Bond. He says also, Batman has cooler cars than Bond. Very true.
Yeah,
very, very true. One thing I do definitely think is worth bringing up here is some Okie dude saying, he questions why the Joker's Batman's opposite, and it's because he's broken and alone, and because he doesn't want or need anybody. He's just a sad wretch. And I know there's a couple folks, further on that agree with you. I actually completely disagree with you. That's not what makes Joker such an adverse foe to Batman. I don't think that's what makes him Batman's greatest enemy. I think at the end of the day, both Batman and the Joker are these two very eternal symbols of Batman trying to prevent crime, trying to prevent the evils of the world, whereas the Joker is eternally evil for the sake of being evil. And it is part of that sort of lack of definition behind the Joker that makes him so scary, because there's no reason behind it. And Batman is, it is the unstoppable force versus the immovable object, very much so. And I don't think it has anything to really do with being broken and alone, because I think Joker is very much concrete in his nihilistic beliefs, and he clearly doesn't see himself as broken. Some writers go as far to call Joker super sane instead of insane. And Batman, on the other hand, is this force for absolute good. You know what I'm saying? It is compromising good for the sake of preventing evil. And I think I don't even know what I just said right there. He is not willing to compromise justice because he wants to prevent the evils of the world from inflicting people the same way it inflicted him. Whereas the Joker is just downright evil for evil's sake. And it is that sort of almost elemental nature to their dichotomy that makes them work so well as foes. And frankly, it's also why I don't want to read Joker stories all the time, because as much as I love the Joker as a villain, I think that he is most efficiently utilized as a sort of accent, as something every couple of years to remind you why Batman is so eternal and why we will always need a Batman.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about the Joker. Don't like the character. I think he's criminally overused. And honestly, I think that the current iteration of the Joker as he exists and as much as he's used now, is reductive to Batman. It reduces him because here's a guy who doesn't have any superpowers. And honestly, I think if Batman's really who we say he is, he could beat the Joker in about 30 seconds, lock him up in a hole, and we'd never have to hear from the Joker again. So the fact that he just keeps coming back, no. I mean, in practicality, no. I understand story-wise and concept-wise, and I agree with a lot of what Knight just said about how they are opposites and why the Joker is needed to provide contrast to Batman. Mm-hmm. But practically, when you talk about a guy that doesn't have superpowers, the Joker wouldn't last 30 seconds against Batman, at least not against my Batman.
Well, the thing I like about it and about that sort of elemental nature of these two characters is that Batman will do practically anything he needs to do in order to accomplish his mission and therefore a greater good. Joker will become anything he needs to become in order to accomplish a greater evil. And I love that sort of contradicting or contrasting nature between those two characters. And again, I believe it should only be used solemnly. I think that's something that you need to build to. I think that is something that is only kind of certified any level of importance when you use that as a contrast to the rest of Batman's rogues gallery, instead of just going Joker, 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 Scarecrow, Joker, Two-Face, Joker, Penguin. It should be, Batman's rogues gallery, the entire thing, and then a Joker story once every 5 years, as far as I'm concerned, because that's where you can really begin to toe the line and say Batman is dealing with all of these sort of mirror images of himself from so many different angles. And then when you finally get to the Joker is a mirror image of everything Batman stands for. It is evil for the sake of evil. It is something that is mutable, right? It is that sort of, fact that the evil of the world will take any form necessary, and Batman will take any form necessary in order to combat that evil. And that sort of symbolism is I think what makes that dynamic so important, rather than an acknowledgement of loneliness, or Joker sort of recognizing that in Batman. I think Joker recognizes that Batman gives him purpose because Batman is the antithesis to his nihilism. And that's what he loves Batman for, because Batman gives Joker a reason to act on his nihilism, right? Batman, and you see that mentioned in a number of other stories, like, for example, the death of the family. All right, Joker wants to break down all of these other things about Batman that he feels compromises Batman's absolutism, because Joker enjoys sort of enacting his own nihilism and his own evils upon the world. And the only way he can continue to do that is if there's something kind of constantly wiping that board clean so that he can write on it again. It is that cyclical nature of those characters that I think makes them important. And their relationship, again, I don't find any sort of human connection between the two of them. It is very much something that is kind of deeper and sinister. And again, I've used this word a lot, but elemental. the war between the Batman and Joker will extend far beyond Bruce Wayne and whoever the initial Joker is. They both left such a lasting legacy on the world that they live in, and even on the freaking multiverse that they live in, that you will continue to see those two sort of eternal forces conflicting with one another for all of time. But you know, I don't know. I think one of the things that I will set myself up for as a challenge is, if I ever get to the point where I write Batman, I have to write a Joker story that is certified thumbs up from Jace. Like, that is going to be one of the things that I strive to do. I'm going to tell my Bat family story, but I also have to tell a Joker story that is so good that Jace is all in on it.
You know, I think every character has a Batman, or every creator rather has a Batman story and a Joker story. And like you were saying, we've had so many different writers on Batman lately. It's like they all want a chance to tell their Joker story, and I'm jokered out at this point. I never was a fan of the character, and man, just Joker overload these days. So I am going to read, that being said, I am going to read 3 Jokers from Jeff Johns, because, you know, I'm a Jeff Johns fan and I'm curious. So we'll see. And I'm reading Joker War because I'm a huge James Tynion fan, but oh man, after these 2 stories, just don't give me any more Joker. And I'm sorry, the Batman Who Laughs, that's just Joker. That's just Joker. That's just another Joker story. So yeah, too much Joker.
Yeah. Like I said, I agree. I think Joker should only be used sparingly, and that's when he's done best. And I agree with Aaron Vio, although I think Jason might disagree. The Joker-Batman relationship is fascinating. And, you know, there's a point where John Thomas here towards the end that, you know, he says that the Joker is the yin to Batman's yang, and I agree. But I think it is in that very elemental and that very eternal way where they are these two conflicting forces constantly at war with one another. And I think that, you know, when you apply something that is so much sort of higher than kind of human urges and human feelings, and something that is so elemental like that, it becomes something, I mean, like, just so set in stone, you know, something that will continue on for an eternity. But we've kind of talked a lot about this type of topic for a while. I do want to break into a couple of other subtopics here. So we began to kind of talk about how, you know, sometimes Batman is reduced, and how people even, I think, take pride in trying to just shit on Batman because Batman is a popular character. You see that a lot. He's too mainstream now. And one of the things that I've always had a distaste for, and I brought it up a little bit earlier, is, you know, how people tend to look at Batman Bruce Wayne and reduce him down to a rich man who beats the shit out of the poor and the mentally ill. And I'm curious, you know, Jace, and for everybody watching, do you find any of that remotely convincing, or are you in my camp, and do you find that completely ludicrous and a complete, like, just sort of hostile misunderstanding of the character?
Yeah, I don't even, I mean, I almost don't even want to discuss it, because I don't want to give the topic any oxygen, because it's so moronic that it's not worth talking about, really. It's clearly somebody from the outside looking in who hasn't read the stories, who doesn't understand the mythos, who's taking it only at, you know, the very, 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 very top of the superficial layer of who this character is. It's politicized, and it's extremely reductive, and it serves no purpose. You know, I mean, right there in your question, why reducing Batman, it's non-productive. You're not going to get anywhere with it. All you're going to do is make people mad. And you're not only being reductive of Batman, you're being reductive of people who are fans of Batman. You're reducing the fandom and the agency of the character for no practical reason. And really, I find the roots of it in the old tired argument that comic books are just for kids, and you know, these stories have no value, which, you know, if anything, comics and comic book movies being at the center of pop culture for the last 15 to 20 years would be a huge argument against that. Clearly, there is value in these stories. Clearly, there's value in the characters and the ideals that they stand for. And I've said this on my podcast, hundreds of times, that I feel like so much of what you can learn about a society at a particular time period is reflected in the fiction that they create, the stories that they create, what fires their imagination, what concepts and ideas and controversial topics are they exploring in the fictional stories that they tell. And here we are, we've been talking about Batman for, coming close to 2 hours here. Clearly there's value. Clearly there's love of the character. Clearly there's a reflection of who we are as people, who we are as a species, in the motivations of these characters. So to be as reductive and honestly troll-like and just looking for a reaction, it's completely asinine and moronic and serves zero purpose in my mind. And when I see those kind of posts online or whatever, I don't even engage. It's not worth it. It really is. Better to just not give it any oxygen.
Well, let me do something that is very inherently tied to DKN and get hyper aggressive about morons who completely misunderstand something that's very important to me. And I very much hate that argument that why doesn't Bruce Wayne just use his money and his position as Bruce Wayne to help people? He fucking does. Are you going to read Batman stories strictly about Bruce Wayne donating money to poor people? Like, really? First of all, I hate this entitlement. And I would almost call it this borderline lack of thinking that people need something to explicitly tell them all the time that something is happening in order for it to happen. Just because I didn't tell Jace that I took a piss before this conversation doesn't mean it doesn't happen. By the fact that it is a bodily human function that occurs multiple times a day, I guess one could assume that I've taken a piss at some point today, correct? So in the same way that you have multiple stories where they do kind of take a step out of Bruce Wayne and acting good as Batman, and they allow him to do something good as Bruce Wayne, using both his platform as a public figure and using his wealth to kind of inaugurate systems and mechanisms that help less fortunate people or those who have been wronged by the world, doesn't mean they need to show it in every single fucking Batman book that exists. The fact that you can see and you read all of these various issues of Batman that show this doesn't mean it suddenly stops there. When Bruce Wayne opens an orphanage, or Bruce Wayne, for example, in a more recent Batman annual during the Tom King run, I believe, when he goes to this orphanage that he had named after his mother, it doesn't mean that just because you don't see him go to the orphanage in the next 20 issues that Batman doesn't go to the orphanage, right? Thematically and I wouldn't even say emotionally, I would just say narratively, it would lead you to believe that after the impact of this issue, maybe Batman visits the orphanage a little bit more, and the writer doesn't feel the need to tell you that Batman visits the orphanage some more. Just because Batman doesn't make a donation to a children's foundation every issue doesn't mean that that's not something that Bruce Wayne perpetuates. He likely does. And the writers likely trust the reader enough to know that Batman's goodness doesn't just stop at him being Batman. It's not like, he's one of those people that is just like, I do enough as Batman, I don't need to do anything else. You see all of these little tidbits in Batman stories where you see him helping people out as Bruce Wayne, whether it's him hiring people with a criminal past, whether it's him giving opportunities to people who would not otherwise have it. You should pretty much assume that it's not going to stop when those things are off panel, right? Like, Batman doesn't suddenly just, like, the writers aren't suddenly saying, oh, well, just because I'm having Batman punch Deathstroke means he's going to pull all of his donations from the fucking Martha Wayne orphanage. Like, it doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? You're left to assume that this is a thing that continues to happen, regardless of him being Batman. And let's be real, if it was flipped the other way around and every fucking story was about Bruce Wayne going to orphanage or starting programs for the unfortunate, like, would you read those stories with the occasional annual about him being Batman? Come the
Only if Tom King wrote it.
huh?
I'd only read them if Tom King was writing it.
Well, it's like, but it's like either way, you know, it's so fucking reductive, and I frankly think that it is moronic to make that assertion because, I mean, I don't know. It is just this notion about fandom in general, where they need. Where they feel the need for like the storytellers to fucking spoon feed them something. Like, I would rather kind of draw some necessary conclusions because a big part of storytelling is implication. It goes beyond explicitly having to tell you when, Bruce Wayne, or we'll take this into example. Bruce Wayne has the Bat family. Just because the last several years of the main Bat title have included the Bat family less and less doesn't mean the Bat family suddenly stops existing. That's going on in the background. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know. I just think it's moronic for people to feel the need, and mostly grown adults, to feel the need for a storyteller to fucking spoon feed them something when it is obviously an implication of small sort of character moments and of even entire issues throughout the series. You know what I'm saying? It is mind-boggling that people would even make that argument. And also, like, Batman's not perfect. Just because he is just this iconic figure does not mean that Batman is not going to make mistakes. Batman might punch the wrong guy every once in a while. And where I'll give even King's Run credit is that little Mr. Freeze arc where he acknowledges how overwhelmed he was because of the sort of drama surrounding Catwoman leaving him at the altar, that he arrested the wrong guy and he made up for that decision. And just because Batman doesn't always, do the exact right thing doesn't mean that he's not sort of compensating for that in the background. And just because it's not given as much weight for the narrative purpose of various stories doesn't mean that it's not something that's sort of coexisting and happening within that space. I don't know. It's just real fucking frustrating for me. And clearly, I know you don't even like talking about it because I can tell that you'd probably be just as frustrated. It doesn't do anybody any good to reduce Batman down to something like that, because not only is it just strictly untrue and ignorant to the character and to what he represents, it's just unnecessarily fucking hostile, man. It reminds me of like when I was first getting into comics when I was like 15, and I was just like, fuck Superman. Like, no, 15-year-old me was a moron. That was stupid and reductive. Like, you can not like a character as much as somebody else. And I know it's kind of popular to hate on mainstream things, but it doesn't make Batman any less endearing because some moron doesn't understand that Batman's altruism doesn't stop when he takes off the cowl. Rant over. Oh, boy, oh boy.
All right, well, it's about time for me to get going. I got to go make dinner for the family. So,
For sure. Yeah.
have any last things that we want to cover here?
I mean, frankly, I think it's, it's worth saying that with all of these iterations of Batman and with the nature of comic books being a periodical medium, I can understand why, people will very much have different interpretations of Batman, because a lot of them are kind of grounded in things that have likely happened within the story and within the continuity of the character. But I generally think that most well-thought fans of the characters or consumers of his stories will understand various through lines, and they'll understand why this character is important. I very much think that this conversation could go on for hours. We could approach sort of how we understand Batman, what we think is meaningful about him, what we think other people misinterpret, for hours. And I don't think there's really any amount of justice that can be done. And I'm sure at some point we can likely do a second part to this. One thing I do want to leave people with is that although it's popular to sort of hate on mainstream things, there's a reason Batman has permeated not only American culture, but world culture at large in such an intimate way. He stands for so many things, and that sort of symbolism behind Batman has affected so many different people in so many different ways. And as corny as it might be to say, I very much find myself being motivated by sort of this archetype of a man doing whatever he needs to do to overcome any adversity in his life for the greater good. And that greater good could be his own greater good. It could be the greater good of his family, his city, his world, even his goddamn multiverse. I think it's empowering. And, you know, it speaks volumes that we can sit here and have such a diverse discussion on a character or on something that doesn't exist, because it very much articulates how multifaceted this character is, both on the page, on the screen, and in the hearts and minds of the fans. So, you know, my question to you, Jace, I think this is going to be an interesting way to sort of leave everybody, is if you had to pick 3 Batman stories that you think perfectly distill the character down to how you understand him, and it doesn't have to be your 3 favorite Batman stories, it could be 3 stories that you think encapsulate how you understand the character, what would they be? And just give a little bit of reasoning why you think those are sort of tent poles of this symbolic figure.
All right, so this is actually going to be really easy for me, and I have sort of a cheat actually as one of my stories. But so when we were doing the 75th anniversary of Batman a couple of years ago, I loaded some Batman stories up on so what I consider the best best Batman stories of all time. I loaded them up on some iPads. I think I had 10 iPads, and it was a contest. I walked around WonderCon, and if you found me on the floor or in a panel, I was tweeting out my location all the time, and you'd come up, and what you would have to do is you would have to name, what did I say? I think I said 5 of the stories that were on. There were about 20 different Batman stories. I put a ton of them on there. You'd have to name, I think, 10 Batman stories, 10 of the greatest Batman stories of all time that were on this iPad before you got 3 wrong. And I didn't necessarily put ones on there that everybody, like I didn't put Dark Knight Returns. I didn't put the most obvious ones, but these 3 were on there, and it was a big hit. Everybody had a lot of fun. It was great. So basically get 10 right before you get 3 strikes. So the first one I'll say is Batman Hush. You know, Jim Lee art, Jeff Loeb, and the reason I'll present that one is because it's not just the Joker, right? It's not even, I wouldn't consider it a Joker story at all, but it shows kind of the versatility. It shows the rogues gallery. It shows who Batman is as a superhero. It's very much a super heroic story. It doesn't get into too much of the motivation or the angst or the examination of Batman as a hero that we were talking about here. But it's a great Superman story, and it's a lot of fun, or a great Batman story rather. It's a lot of fun, and it's got great art. So I would definitely put that one on the list. Now this next one, and a lot of people love Batman Hush. In fact, I have the absolute volume right behind me on my shelf there. It's spectacular. The next one I'm going to put on there is much more obscure. And you know, when you start talking about what if things were different, how Batman had turned out. There's a Batman special from 1984. It's written by Mike W. Barr, and it's just called Batman Special #1. And it introduces this character called the Wraith. And supposedly, on the same night that Batman's parents were killed, there was a rookie cop by the name of James Gordon who killed this thief who was stealing a TV. And he killed this thief right in front of the thief's son. And that thief swore vengeance on all law enforcement. So almost like a mirror image of who Batman is. And so in that way, it examines who Batman is, his motivations, why he does what he does. And I read it at a time, I was like, 10 years old when I read it. And it was just spectacular. It always stuck with me. And I hear people around my same age that talk about it as one of the best Batman stories. It doesn't get a lot of attention, so I would point to that one as well. And the third one, here's where I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit. So there's a Batman annual. I think it's Batman #9, and it's called The Many Faces of Batman. And it actually has 4 stories in it, so it's kind of more than one story. But it gives you like Batman as the detective, Batman as the hero, Batman as the myth, and I can't remember what the last one is, but it's told by some creators who I think Dan Jurgens does the art or writes one of the stories, but it gives the different faces, the different aspects of who Batman is as a character.
Yeah.
Kind of examines them in a very a very cool way that you can kind of, again, much like that issue with the Wraith that gives you, hey, here's the motivations behind Batman. Here's a all-in-one book, all-in-one annual that kind of explores the different facets of who Batman is. So those would be my three: Batman Hush, which obviously is a longer arc in the Batman title, and then the one-shot Batman special from 1984 by Mike W. Barr, and then Batman Annual 9, Many Faces of Batman. Those would be my three. You read those three stories, you're going to have a good, robust understanding of I think who Batman is. And the other two, the Batman annuals from the mid 80s, obviously Batman special from 1984, you're going back kind of before Frank Miller and kind of who Batman is now. But I think that's going to give you, read those first. That'll give you a good foundation. Then read Batman Hush, and you'll see how he's been modernized a little bit. So they're not, I think, Hush is obviously a pretty popular one, but the other two are not really well known, I think. It's easy to say, oh, read Dark Knight Returns, or, read Killing Joke, or whatever like that. No, go back and read some of the stuff that's a little less well known, because I think it will give you a good understanding of who Batman is. And Hush, it's a great introduction to the world of Batman, and just about all of his villains get a chance to shine. Scarecrow, Riddler, Red Hood makes an appearance. So yeah, it's a great story.
Huh. Yeah, I actually really I really admire the mention of that Wraith annual, or Wrath. I think his name is Wrath, right? It's Wrath.
It's either Wrath or Wraith, yeah.
But yeah, I really like that mention. I think that's a really interesting sort of inspection of literally a mirror of Bruce Wayne's dynamics. Mm-hmm. So I admire that a lot. So two of my mentions are just beefy fucking runs that I just think in multiple ways sort of explore Batman and things that I find very important. But I'll start with the smallest one, the most contained, and it's Batman Ego. One of the things that I discussed is the necessity to understand the balance between Batman and Bruce Wayne, and what happens when that balance is too far leaning one side or the other. And Ego very much explores that. It is a fantastic story that I think is fundamental to the Batman mythos. It is written and drawn by the fucking incredible Darwin Cook. It is brilliantly done visually, so well written. It encapsulates so much of what I find important to this character, and literally, it discusses this sort of psychology and the ego of Batman in such a heightened way that I think has never really been matched in comic books since then. So I would 100% recommend Batman Ego by Darwin Cook. My next one I've mentioned in this discussion is the entire Batman and Robin New 52 run by Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason. It is a beefy boy. I got a big old omnibus over there, but it nonetheless is an astounding read. It attacks sort of Batman's familial relationships on so many different fronts, especially dealing finally in a very intimate way with Batman coming to grips with having his actual son, and especially with dealing with the sort of dynamic that Damian was raised by killers and Batman is the antithesis to all killers. Going as far as Batman, it very much embodies that part of the conversation where I had mentioned how Batman will go to almost any end in order to accomplish his goals. And, spoilers for, something that is years old. But when Damian dies early on in the New 52, Batman literally fights the devil in order to bring his son back, and in such an astounding way. And it is pulled off so well that Tomasi and Gleason don't have to compromise the heart for the sort of bombast and the massively kind of like science fictional landscape it is so well balanced. You know, you understand and can appreciate how big and crazy and inherently comic booky that story is, but there's also a lot of heart to it, and it's about, you know, a father rescuing his son from, you know, the kind of ultimate pitfall, which is death, right? And I just, it's a beautiful story. It's super consistent, and it kind of attacks that angle of Batman as a father figure from multiple angles, and that's kind of where I'm trying to get at. You know, the things that I had really stressed on in this conversation are, you know, Batman's motives, Batman as a father, and the balance of Batman and Bruce Wayne. So we've talked about the balance of Batman and Bruce Wayne through ego. We've talked about, you know, me giving a recommendation to understand Batman as a paternal figure. Next is actually Scott Snyder's Batman run in the New 52. That book very much defines Batman's motivations, and how Batman will go to will go to great ends in order to accomplish, you know, an absolution of justice. And I really love the sort of metaphors that he uses surrounding Gotham City as sort of various mental states, and how Batman is able to really shift, you know, even the most dark, even the most corrupt sort of mental state into something that is uplifting and symbolic. You know, there's something about that last issue where it's Batman standing atop the gargoyle with the sun coming up, right? And it's so symbolic to how everlasting and how, you know, sort of eternal Batman's war on crime is, and how, you know, although the sun is coming up on Gotham, that's not the end, because there is never an end. The sun will come up every day, and Batman will be there to watch over his city. And it very much comments a lot on sort of depression and a lot of these very real things that people have to face, and how Batman overcomes a lot of those trials in, you know, these very sort of accentuated ways. And it sort of teaches us as readers and as sort of consumers of the story to take the evils of the world and to fight back, right? There's this constant imagery of Batman rising above the city. And I really, really do love that, because it both sort of balances Batman's darkness and emotional trauma, as well as why Batman is an important symbol. So those are sort of the three big things that I'd like to represent in trying to encapsulate Batman, and what he means to me as a character. So, you know, with my long-winded explanation out of the way, if you guys enjoy this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe down to the channel below for more conversations like this. I can guarantee you will see Jace here more and more on the channel, as he has been. I feel like we've definitely had an uptick in collaborations as of these last couple months, and vice versa. You can also find me over on Jace's podcast for a couple of different appearances, and you'll see me again fairly soon, using the link below. On that, Jace, do you have anything coming up aside from the little technical mishap today that the people should be aware of?
Yeah, actually, something that just came out today, actually, it was an interview with Christopher Cantwell. He, for those not familiar, he was the showrunner for *Halt and Catch Fire*, which was a period drama piece, kind of like Mad Men, but this was set in the 80s, had to do with technology, personal computers, and that whole thing. It ran for 4 seasons. He was the co-creator and the co-showrunner on that, so absolutely spectacular. But he also grew up reading comics, and he loves comics, and he has a couple of titles over at Dark Horse, Everything, and She Could Fly. The series are completed. He may go back to She Could Fly at some point, but currently he's writing Doctor Doom for Marvel, and he's also relaunching Iron Man next month. And he's a big comics fan, and he's super talented, great guy. So we talked for over an hour, and a really good conversation. So encourage everybody to go over and listen to that. I do have some other interviews that are coming up, but nothing's concrete yet, so I can't. I don't want to, let the cat out of the bag before it's ready to go. But typical schedule. We cover Marvel books on Mondays. We have X-Men books on Tuesdays. Wednesdays, before you head to your comic shop, if you want to know what's coming out that day, we have New Comics Wednesday. So Marvel chronology, we're going through the entire history of Thanos on Saturdays, starting, and this isn't a publishing order. This is starting with the stories that were written that go back the earliest. So the very first Thanos issues we covered for the reading order was Jason Aaron's Thanos Rising series, and then we've gotten into a lot of the Starlin stuff. So there's always great stuff over there. So really the best way to keep track of what I'm up to is follow me on Twitter. I always tweet out when new episodes come out and let you know what they're about. And you can, if you follow me on Twitter, you can also eavesdrop on all my conversations I have with creators. I've been doing this for a long time. A lot of them are friends, and we have a good time joking around and giving each other crap, especially because we haven't been able to see each other this summer since there's no cons. So yeah, always appreciate everybody's support by downloading the episode and retweeting, and always love to answer questions on Twitter and engage. So yeah, anytime you have a question about comics, my philosophy is I just want everybody reading comic books, because I think there's a comic book out there for everybody. It's just a matter of matching up the right story with the right person, because everybody loves stories, man. That's why we all watch TV and go to the movies. So comics are the same, just you have a bigger library at any given time with comics. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, if I can vouch for my conversational partner tonight, he makes some of the most consistent content out there on the internet, and he generates a lot of really interesting topics, and is far better about staying on said topics than I am. So if you want a really well-structured sort of conversation around comics, make sure to go check Jace out. And obviously you can use either the link below or the scrolling Twitter tag here to follow him. And I'm sure along the way you will see the two of us disagree about something on the internet, as we do, but in a very friendly and constructive way. But with everything being said, I very much want to thank everybody for joining in live and contributing to the conversation with their own thoughts. We appreciate you, and all of the support is it just means a lot. It is really astounding at how we can sort of build these communities to discuss something that we all very much care about. And when we get into characters like Batman that are so big and so much larger than life, it's so great to see how many different ways people can connect to these characters, and trying to understand the various access points that everybody has is pretty incredible. So I want to thank everybody for being a part of this community. I want to thank everybody for joining us live, and for those of you watching us in post, feel free to interact in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed, of course, make sure to check out Jace using the link in the description below. Subscribe to the channel. And this is going to be DarkKnightNation and Jace from the Comic Source Podcast signing out from another great episode of Let's Talk Comics. See you guys later.
All right. Take care, guys. Thanks for having me, Knight.
Anytime, brother.